Welcome to Acton Line, a product of the Acton Institute promoting a free and virtuous society. I'm Mark Townsend, producer. You can find additional resources in the show notes for this episode, as well as previous episodes of Acton Line at acton.org/podcasts. If you have a comment or an idea for a future episode, you can email us at podcast@acton.org. Acton Line is available to stream on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and acton.org. This episode of Acton Line was recorded at Acton University, our flagship conference. Acton University is a 4-day exploration of theology, philosophy, entrepreneurship, international development, and market-based economics. Each day is filled with thought-provoking presentations on the intellectual and practical foundations of a free society. At Acton University, you can sharpen your intellect, expand your worldview, and learn the foundations of genuine human flourishing. To learn more, visit university.acton.org.
Welcome. My name is Dan Huger, Librarian and Research Associate at the Acton Institute. Today I'm joined by Samuel Gregg. Sam is President and Frederick Hayek Chair in Economics and Economic History at the American Institute for Economic Research. He is also an affiliate scholar at the Acton Institute. Today we'll be talking about the life and legacy of Catholic writer, theologian Michael Novak. In the summer 2025 issue of Religion and Liberty, Sam has a terrific essay, Michael Novak, the Thoroughly Catholic Capitalist, which I would encourage listeners to read. Sam, welcome to Acton Line, and thank you for being with us.
Thanks, Dan. It's good to be with you to talk about Michael Novak.
So in the beginning of your piece, you start out talking about how Michael Novak led a sort of 20th century life. And I was thinking about it as I was reading this, and I'm like, the youngest listeners to this podcast never lived in the 20th century. And so it might be a good place to start to just talk about sort of the America that Michael Novak was born into and the American church at that time and what that environment was like to sort of orient our conversation.
So Michael Novak was born in the early 1930s. So he was born in the middle of the Great Depression, which I think is an experience that very few people alive today can actually remember. And that he was also brought up in an immigrant family. By that I mean his parents were first generation immigrants, children of immigrants from Slovakia, a country in Central Eastern Europe. And so he grew up in a community which was quite different from what you might call white Anglo-Saxon Protestant America. He's growing up in a society which is going through a terrible economic time. He's growing up in a society in which Catholicism is as much about ethnic identity and in some cases political identity as well as it is a faith, a religion. And Catholicism was integral to everything that his family did. He had an older brother who became a priest, who was killed in Pakistan, I believe, as a missionary. Michael Novak himself, went into the seminary as a very young man. Eventually decided that being a priest, he never got ordained. He left before he was ordained. We're talking about a church that is... It's growing in America, but it's clearly not fully part of America because America was still at the time a heavily Anglo-Saxon Protestant world, understood itself that way. And Catholics had been in America, of course, from the early 17th century in the colony of Maryland, right, which was set up by Lord Baltimore, who was an English Catholic, and it was a place where they actually had a religious toleration for Christians of all confessions. But Catholics started migrating to the United States in the middle of the 19th century, Ireland, Germany, etc. And then towards the end of the 19th century, lots of Poles, people from Slovakia, etc. But Catholicism was as much a question of ethnic identity as it was about religious beliefs. And in fact, a lot of Catholics at that time, especially someone like Michael Novak, he's not even coming from the dominant group within American Catholicism, which is Irish American Catholicism. He's not even coming from that. He's coming from a group within that particular group. But Catholicism, there were lots of Catholics in America at this time, but they weren't, I think it's fair to say, fully yet integrated into what people understood what it meant to be American. I think that changes a lot after the Second World War. It sort of reaches a type of flip-over point with the election of John F. Kennedy as the first Catholic to become president of the United States. And we forget how controversial that was at the time.
Absolutely.
There were people saying, we cannot vote for this man because he's going to be obviously the slave of the Pope in Rome, etc.
Yeah. Lester DeCoster, who was a supporter of the Acton Institute, who donated much of the Acton Institute's library, got involved in a controversy when he published in the Reformed Journal a sort of like case for Protestants voting for President Kennedy, which he marginalized himself amongst a lot of the Reformed in West Michigan during that time.
Well, also keep in mind that this is a period of time in which to be Catholic was, for the most part, to be identified as Democrat.
Yes.
Capital D Democrat. The northeast of the United States was a very heavily Catholic population. A lot of the cities had heavy Catholic populations. And they tended to vote Democrat. I think partly because the Republican Party was seen as the type of establishment party, if you like, etc. But it also involved Catholics getting involved in very weird political alliances, right? Because in the Democratic Party was very dominant in the South, and the Democratic Party in the South not only didn't like African Americans very much, they didn't like Catholics very much either, and there were very few Catholics living in the South, and yet that was part of the Democratic coalition. Southerners and Northeastern Catholics that put people like Franklin Roosevelt into office. And remember, it was Al Smith, I think, was the first Catholic to run in 1928, I think it was, for president. And one of the reasons he lost, he was a Democrat, and he lost because a lot of people voted against him because of his Catholicism.
So Michael Novak grows up in this very insular Catholic environment, goes to seminary, leaves. Where does his life take him from there? I mean, he starts writing. He writes a novel at one point. Could you unpack a little bit of that chronology of his writing life and how he finds his legs as a journalist and as a fiction writer?
So, like a lot of people who go into seminary and then decide. And in his case, right towards the end of his seminary training, he decided, look, I just don't think I'm called to be a priest. He had to face the question, so what do I do next? And that's a challenge for a lot of people who have been through that. Well, what do I do? I've spent all this time doing theology and philosophy, and that doesn't actually equip me for doing all sorts of types of occupations in the world, so to speak. And he very early decided that he wanted to be a writer, writing at least initially fiction, like novels. But he also wanted to start writing about the world around him, and by that I mean politics, culture, etc. And that leads him also to be becoming a journalist. He wanted to be writing for newspapers, and he talks about how, as a young man, he'd write these articles for book reviews for newspapers and things like that. And we still remember the first time he got a check. It was $5 or something like, which is more than a sizable sum in those days.
More than journalists get paid today relative to inflation.
Exactly. So he was very drawn to being engaged in the world through writing for wider audiences. So he's not what we would call a public intellectual at this point. In fact, the notion of public intellectual really doesn't exist in the way that it does today in the So we're really talking about the 1950s at this particular point in time. And we should also keep in mind that at this point of his life, he identifies himself with, like his parents and his family, as a Democrat, capital D Democrat. He's also identifying himself as a political liberal in the sort of progressive sense of the American progressive, not classical liberal, but American progressive liberal. Not an extreme version by any sense, but the New Deal is part of the way we are. Roosevelt was a great president. This society is one in which we need to be moving further forward in realizing greater justice for example, for women, for African Americans, etc. But he doesn't detach himself from thinking about matters theological or matters religious. And he really first comes to public attention when he starts writing about those types of topics. So I think maybe the best thing that ever happened in Michael Novak's life was, apart from marrying his wife, Karen Loeb, who was a force in her own right, I can tell you.
Yeah.
The best thing that happened to Michael Novak was the Second Vatican Council.
Yeah.
Because it really, he realized that this was an opportunity for him to bring all these things that he'd learned in seminary and sort of his intimate knowledge of the workings of the church in America and around the world, and we're really talking about the church before Vatican II, to bring that together with his writing for these broader audiences so that he could explain. He wanted to explain what this was about, not just to American audiences, but lots of different, primarily English-speaking audiences, about what this event was and its wider significance.
Yep. So he's covering the Second Vatican Council. And out of that coverage, in the aftermath of that coverage, he writes a book called The Open Church. This is one of the books you mentioned in your review or in your essay, and I wanted to dive a little bit into how that book characterized the council and the work that the council did, and because it gives insight into sort of like Novak's thought on the future of the church coming out of the council, and what was that vision that he saw that the council fathers putting forward?
Well, the book title itself, I think, gives it away. It's talking about the open church. Now, by that, he did not mean that the church was just going to sit back and just accept everything that's going on in modernity, that the church had nothing to contribute to modernity. But he's talking about a church which he sees as moving away from a relatively closed model. By that, I don't mean that Catholics aren't just living in the world alongside other people. What I mean is that there's a sense that modernity is a threat. That, and I'm not talking about science, I'm not talking about technology, I'm talking about the post-Enlightenment world is seen as a type of threat. And this is not surprising, given that the post-Enlightenment world was not particularly pleasant for the Catholic Church. You only have to think about the French Revolution, for example, and the way in which ideas associated with the revolution, particularly with the way that it thought about religion, or at least some of its advocates thought about religion, and the way it thought about the institutional place of the church in society, the Catholic Church was still in a mode of resistance, pulling up the drawbridge, resistance to this. Now, there's plenty of Catholics involved in the world. There are plenty of Catholics doing science and plenty of Catholics doing all sorts of things. But that was the sort of mindset that characterized a lot of the pre-Vatican II church. And one of the things that John the 23rd wanted to do was to open up a wider conversation between this post-Enlightenment world and Catholicism. And for Novak, that's the significance of the open church. It's not an opening up that just says, okay, now we're going to just change everything so we can fit in with whatever the modern world says. It's much more, we need to understand this world and be open to the insights of this world so that we can convey what we as Catholics believe to be the truth to this world. And so he was at he was at one of the sessions of the Vatican Council. And he observed this dynamic, this conflict between those people, those bishops, we're really talking about bishops, bishops who were, we really can't change, there's nothing that's worth changing, the modern world is fundamentally flawed, there's nothing to learn, etc. And then you have another group, which I guess you'd associate with people like Hans Kuhn, Edward Schillebeeckx, etc., theologians who wanted a type of radical opening of the church to the world. And then you have another group in which people like Karol Wojtyła, later John Paul II, or Joseph Ratzinger, later Benedict XVI, had a more dynamic view of this openness. So it means opening up the world, so not being defensive, engaging the world, but also teaching the world at the same time. And so Novak, it's interesting because when you read The Open Church, he does this through exploring the personalities of a lot of the participants. So the sort of the person who's seen as a sort of the arch traditionalist ogre is Cardinal Alfred Ottaviani. He's the head of the Holy Office, and he's famous for saying things like, you can believe what you want about the Trinity, but if you vote communist, your excommunication will arrive the next day. But he was absolutely, his motto was basically no change, no change, no change. But Michael presented a very sort of sympathetic picture of him. He didn't demonize him. He didn't make him out to be a monster. And then he did the same with other important figures at the council. And so the effect was to introduce many of these different ways about thinking about the church's relationship with modernity through these particular figures. What's also interesting is that it's often seen, that book is often portrayed as being very optimistic. But there are parts of it you read and you realize, okay, Novak can see problems that are going to emerge from this process. He's by no means saying we should stop this process, let's just go back to 1958. He's not saying that at all. There are cautions that he offers. Things like, if you're expecting X and Y to happen, you probably have some overwrought expectations of what this council is actually about and what it's supposed to achieve. So, he was seen at the time as being quite on the progressive side of the debate when it came to intra-church things. But there are these intimations of the type of theological, political, and economic, which is the last one is what he's most famous for, ideas that he would talk about in the second half of his life.
There is there's this transition period to the second half of his life where he gains his fame through his coverage of the Second Vatican Council. He becomes a very prominent voice.
Yes.
He's the public intellectual now.
Right.
This is the transition from journalist to public intellectual, and he's still writing about the world too, and he's writing about politics, and he's still in that American mid-century world where Catholic politics is Democratic Party politics. Right. What does that writing look like in the wake of the Second Vatican Council? Because that begins to shift from him. He returns into that world, but over the next 10, 15 years, he becomes progressively alienated from that world.
Yes, so he comes back from the Second Vatican Council and he would be conventionally described as being on the progressive side of debates within the Catholic Church, but also on the progressive side of the Democratic Party as well. And that's the dynamic that operates for a lot of his life in the 1960s. He worked on, several Democrat presidential campaigns. The phrase "the new frontier" has been attributed to Michael Novak. So he was very involved in democratic politics, but he's also doing academic things as well. So he's writing about things that go outside theology. He starts writing about things like ethnicity. He starts writing histories of particular parts of America that are very important to him. He also, by the late 1960s, he's seen as somewhat of a radical, actually, both in the church and within the Democratic Party. Now, keep in mind, he's a very affable person. He's not the sort of nasty, in-your-face type, but he's seen as sort of somewhat radical. Then in the 1970s, he starts to change. This is when the change had been happening for a while, but it starts to become more manifest in the 1970s. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is he sees the Democratic Party drifting further and further to the left. And he sees it as becoming alienated from many of the blue-collar, working-class ethnic communities, many of which were heavily Catholic, that he had grown up in.
Yeah.
So he talks at one point about, being out in some campaign, some Democratic campaign, they're standing outside a factory, or the workers are coming out, and he talks about how he was walking these very burly men who looked like their grandparents all came from Eastern Europe, etc. And he talks about he's standing there and there's this young woman, a young Democratic political operative, wearing the shortest of short skirts with a pro-choice button on her lapel, clearly part of the counterculture at the time. And Michael's, what? But these are my people, and they don't seem to like this young lady very much. And it's not because she's a woman; it's because there's some sort of dissonance between the way that they understand and what they believe about the world. And then that starts to translate into economics. He starts thinking about questions of poverty. And remember, this is a time when the New Deal is still in people's memory. It's also the time of the Great Society programs. In the late 1960s, he's one of the first people to start saying things like, look, I think these Great Society programs are hurting poorer communities in America, particularly African-American communities. He actually preceded Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who famously wrote a whole critique, who was very much a progressive Democrat, but wrote a whole critique of what the Great Society programs were doing to poorer people, particularly to African-American communities, and he was very critical of this. Michael sort of preceded a lot of that. He was the pathfinder for a lot of that. But he also starts asking questions about, okay, if I'm serious about poverty, what is it that gets people out of poverty? And that's when you see him starting to transition away from conventional mid-20th century Democratic center-left positions of that period, which are essentially Keynesian in the way they think about the world economically. Interventionism is seen as a welcome thing. The notion of free markets is very much seen as, well, that's being dispensed with because the Depression proved that didn't work, etc. And in the 1970s, Michael starts saying, well, I think maybe, and he would use the phrase capitalism rather than free markets. Capitalism, I think, is the way that we solve these types of problems. And this sort of comes to a crescendo in the mid-1970s. He told me this once. He gave a talk at University of Notre Dame, and it was basically him coming out as a capitalist, right? And he would tell me the story. He gave this lecture and how he thought capitalism was the way forward, and he gave a very clear definition of what he meant by that, etc. And he said no one would talk to him when he went to the cafeteria afterwards. No one would talk to him. So that marks a big departure in the previous trajectory of his life. He's still somewhat of a progressive Catholic, but at this point, he's very much moving in the direction of, like a lot of people at the time actually, moving towards appreciation of the works of people like F.A. Hayek, Milton Friedman, and even further back, he's starting to read things like Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. Yeah.
So there's this time in the mid-70s, sort of throughout the world, but particularly throughout the English-speaking world, that historians call this various things. One of the labels that I like is the neoliberal turn.
Right.
Where you get these folks that start rethinking the sort of Keynesian economic orthodoxy that came out of the Second World War. Because there are real problems in the world in terms of growth, economic development, all of this seems to be stagnating on the one hand. You get inflation paired with it, which, according to the theory, they weren't supposed to be able to happen at the same time.
Inflation is high unemployment and high inflation, which Keynes said you wouldn't have at the same time.
Yeah. And you have all of these developed countries facing a lot of these problems. So a lot of folks begin to take a fresh look at this, just because there's real on the ground struggles,
including a lot of people on the left.
Yes,
which is interesting.
Yeah, it was a Labour government in New Zealand that made this turn.
It's the same when I was growing up in Australia. It was a Labour government that liberalised the economy, not the Conservatives. It was a Labour government.
Yeah, and here in the United States, Carter even began this process for select industries. Is Novak? Is this informed by this reading that he's doing, or is this informed more by sort of having his ear to the ground as a journalist and realizing that the American economy is changing in a way that is sort of negatively impacting the lives of a lot of people? What was the mix there?
So I think it's both.
Yeah.
So he's looking at many of the communities from which he emerged, and he sees that they're becoming less competitive economically. He's deeply concerned about the effects of the welfare state upon blue-collar Americans, whatever their race, interestingly enough. He is also, like a lot of people at the time, it's getting harder and harder for the regimes in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. It's getting harder and harder to disguise the fact that these economies are failing, significantly failing. And he's looking around and saying, well, we have high unemployment, we have high inflation. This is not tenable in the long term. So he's got his eye on what's going on, but then he turns to some of these writers to get a sense of what it is that should be done. He's also aware, we should add, that in some parts of the Catholic Church, particularly in Latin America, you see other people dissatisfied with the status quo, but taking a very different position in the sense of they're using Marxist analysis to try and understand what's going wrong, particularly in the conditions of developing economies in Latin America, and for better or worse, turning to more intervention on the part of the state to try and deal with some of these problems. So he's very aware that there's this, the emergence of liberation theology is one way in which one part of the Catholic Church is trying to think through some of these particular economic and political challenges. Michael goes in a very different direction.
Yeah. So let's map out that sort of direction. So there are two books that I think about with this direction. One is Spirit of Democratic Capitalism, which is still an amazing, highly recommended book, as relevant today as it ever was. And he also wrote a book called on liberation theology.
Yes.
Called Will It Liberate?
Right.
So he looks at the world, a sort of Keynesian consensus is breaking down. He puts forward a positive position on the one hand, and then responds to another positive reappraisal of economics. So let's start with Novak's response, because it's not merely, Spirit of Democratic Capitalism is not merely an argument, the recapitulation of these arguments that he finds earlier. He brings his theological training to this, and it's a really unique book. Could you just describe it and unpack a little bit of what the argument is and how it works, and particularly how it interacts with the church's social teaching?
So it began as an essay called The Spirit of Democratic Capitalism. That's my best memory of how it all began. But you're right, he basically wants to present a positive case for democratic capitalism, by which he means three things. He means a market economy, a democratic society, political order in which government is limited, and a certain type of moral cultural setting. So those are the three parts of the trinity, if you like. Yeah. He would even say that, the trinity of his vision of Spirit of Democratic Capitalism. And he does something which had not been done by a serious Catholic theologian, which is to make not just the economic argument for markets, which is, it was still around. People were still willing to argue these things and still willing to put forward those positions. But he integrates it with a theological anthropology of the human person. And this is a little bit revolutionary at the time, because there's not just the phenomenon of Latin America and liberation theology. The Catholic social teaching at this point had more or less moved into what I would call a 1970s Italian Christian, mildly left-wing Italian Christian Democrat view of the world. So even private property is the traditional position on private property is heavily qualified, more qualified than had ever been qualified before. Things like, if you read the encyclical promulgated by Paul VI, Populum Progressio, very much reflective of an interventionist view of the economy. Free trade is actually seen as a negative thing, etc. So he's really going up against challenging the state of Catholic social teaching at that particular point in time. The political dimension of this is that this book comes out in 1982. 2 years earlier, Michael Novak had been very much involved in a group called Democrats for Reagan.
Yes.
And he was one of a good number of Democrats in the late 1970s, early 1980s, who were deeply frustrated with the progressive direction of the Democratic Party, deeply frustrated with Jimmy Carter as a president, did not want to buy into the Malaise vision, the famous Malaise speech that Jimmy Carter gave, etc. And they liked Reagan's optimism. They liked his willingness to sort of challenge the economic orthodoxies of the time, etc. And so this book was also important because it was directed to a lot of people of faith who were wrestling with this conundrum, or at least as they understood, about I'm voting Republican, I'm in favor of markets and limited government, but my church, and not just Catholic, but Protestant, and in the Jewish world, of course, the economic debate in that part of the religious world was very much to the left. So he's challenging his own political party. He's still a Democrat. He remains a Democrat for most of his life, up until I think maybe the early 2000s. He's challenging his party, he's challenging his church, and he's also providing people of faith with a positive way of thinking about markets that includes but goes beyond economics.
Yeah, because a lot of these communities, Michael Novak has another book called Unmeltable Ethics.
Yes.
These are the folks that when people talk about Reagan Democrats in general, a lot of these folks are these Eastern European ethnic communities.
Places like Pennsylvania, Ohio.
Yep. And these are the real voters that swing in that 1980 election. And Michael Novak is sort of the spokesman for this group. So this book, The Spirit of Democratic Capitalism, comes out. What sort of response does it receive? Because while Novak has moved in this direction, while a lot of Catholic voters who come from the communities, the sort of communities that Michael Novak grew up in, are very receptive to President Reagan's message.
Less so the Catholic hierarchy, though.
Less so the Catholic hierarchy, Catholic academic elites at the time, and sort of Catholic cultural elites at the time. They are not representative of, they are in fact alarmed by a lot of this shift.
Yes. So the first Republican president to get a majority of what's called the Catholic vote, I'm not sure it exists anymore, but at the time I think it sort of did, was Richard Nixon in 1972. And I think that was very much a reaction of a lot of, conservative, what we would call conservative Catholics in the Democratic Party. There was a reaction against what they saw as the chaos in the Democratic Party, and the leftward drift. In the 1980s, when Novak writes this book, it's received very well by a lot of lay Catholics, the type of people you're describing, so people from these ethnic communities, etc., but also by a lot of Catholic entrepreneurs and business leaders who had been told for most of their life that what their profession was basically useful but not particularly meritorious. And so that's a great comfort for a lot of these Catholics who are voting Republican for the first time in their lives in many respects, and they're buying into this economic message of Reagan, and they see resonance of this in Michael Novak's Spirit of Democratic Capitalism. But as you say, there is the Catholic intellectual establishment, there is and maybe even more so, the Catholic hierarchy of the time. They're older, right? So they're in their 70s, so they're still wedded on in many respects to the Democratic Party that they grew up in which to be Catholic meant to be Democrat.
Yeah.
And so Novak was running into opposition from a lot of Catholic intellectuals at the time, particularly on the progressive side, but even some conservative Catholics were not happy with this. But there are a lot of bishops who were not happy with this either. And it was partly because he was such a well-known name in America at this point. So when he's saying, look, I think there is a thing called democratic capitalism. I think this is good. I think it's preferable to the alternatives. This is a message that a lot of Catholic bishops do not receive very well across the theological divisions within the Bishops' Conference at the time. Remember, in 1986, the Bishops' Conference put out a document called Economic Justice for All, and which was primarily put together by Archbishop Rembrandt Weekland. And it's very much it says what you would expect a Catholic document to say about life issues and cultural issues and all that. But otherwise, it's basically a left liberal analysis of the economy and policy prescriptions for the economy. And one of the things that Michael Novak did was he put together what was called the Lay Commission.
Yes.
So he brought together a group of Catholic economists, Catholic business leaders, etc., and he basically drafted this statement, right? And it was a lay response to what the bishops had said, and they were presenting a very different message to what the bishops had said. And this is sort of unprecedented at this time, that a bunch of Catholic lay people would put together a document saying, well, you've issued this letter for us to read, and here's our response. And he was very much the driving force behind that.
And I have a copy at my desk. This is called Toward the Future. And it's an amazing sort of document. It's an amazingly sophisticated analysis of a lot of the problems with economic justice for all. But it's also it's very respectful in its engagement. This is not like a fire starter sort of approach. This is gathering together experts, thinking through these issues from a very theological lens. When the first time I read that book, I was actually startled at how much of it was explicitly theological rather than economic arguments.
Yes.
And it's fascinating. Before we move on to too far down the timeline of Michael Novak's life, I want to go back and talk about his response to liberation theology.
Ah, yes.
Will it liberate? Because Michael Novak is offering an alternative here, but there are all sorts of theologians, particularly in Latin America, who are also offering an alternative to the sort of standard left liberalism, a more radical, more leftist alternative.
Marxist.
Yeah, a Marxist alternative in Latin America. How does Michael Novak get interested in liberation theology, and how does he evaluate it?
So I think at the risk of patting Acton on the back, I think it's important to know that the founder of the Acton Institute, Father Robert Sirico, was a seminarian at the time and got to know Michael Novak, and he played a major role in Michael's decision to write this book, this Will It Liberate? Reflections on liberation theology. So that's an important historical point that I think needs to be sort of stressed. Now, what's interesting, though, is that the critiques of liberation theology in the 1980s that were coming from the Holy See, there were two documents they came out from what was called the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, which was then headed up by Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, who later became Benedict XVI. And the CDF, as it was called, what used to be called the Holy Office.
Yes.
This is the doctrinal orthodoxy group, right? They formally write documents that engage in a theological critique of liberation theology, particularly its reliance upon Marxist analysis. And the theological argument they put forward is that Marxist analysis is incompatible with a Christian understanding of the person and the world and a Christian understanding of history, etc. So to the extent that liberation theology relies upon and draws upon Marxist ideology and Marxist analysis, it cannot be embraced by Catholics. So that's the theological fight. There's a theological fight about theological method and the use of this way of analyzing the world. Because the argument was, well, we can use Marxist analysis without buying into the premises of Marxist philosophy. And the CDF, the two CDF documents, particularly the first one, instruction on certain aspects of the theology of liberation is what it's called.
Yeah.
It specifically says no. If you use Marxist analysis, you're implicitly buying into Marxist primacy. So this is a problem because Marxism is clearly incompatible with Christianity.
Yeah.
Novak sort of acknowledges all that and says, yes, there's a serious theological debate that's going on in this theory. What he regards as CDF is right. There are serious theological problems. But Michael's approach is to ask the very practical question, will it actually liberate people from poverty? And there's two things he points out. One is that the liberation theologians didn't really have a positive program forward. So when you ask them, what do you need to do? The typical liberation theologian at the time would basically articulate something like a pretty hardcore socialist response. Mm-hmm. Collectivize property, get rid of profits, competition should be severely constrained, more government intervention, etc. And Michael's point was that they weren't coming up with a distinct vision of a way forward. The Marxist analysis was about criticizing what they saw, but they didn't really have much of a positive agenda. So if you don't have a positive agenda, then you can't really articulate what it means to liberate. And to the extent that they did offer some type of positive agenda, he pointed out that they did tend to go down a socialist, in some cases a hard collectivist path in terms of the alternatives they were offering. And Michael pointed out, well, that's been tried.
Yeah.
It's been tried in the Soviet Union, it's been tried in Central and Eastern Europe, and we can look at these economies now. We know that it doesn't work, right? Because this is a time when even people were still saying, well, maybe the Soviet Union will one day overtake the United States. Paul Samuelson,
the famous
right?
graph,
right? Paul Samuelson, who wrote the standard textbook for economics after the Second World War. The famous graph. He's showing that the Soviet Union will eventually overtake the United. He's still doing that in 1989, right?
Yeah.
And so this was.
Although the date is moving back.
Yes,
in
that's
each
right.
edition.
That's right. Yeah, conveniently. So Michael points out that the liberation theologians, not only do they not really have a distinct way forward, but to the extent they do, they're drawing upon ideas that have been thoroughly refuted. So he's saying there is a practical dimension to this. You, the liberation theologians, talk about praxis all the time. Praxis is what leads things, right? It's not orthopraxis, it's not orthodoxy, it's orthopraxis that leads. That's their position. And he's saying, well, you want to talk about praxis, let's look at the results of the practice of different economic systems. And it's very clear that capitalism, economically speaking, certainly outstrips collectivism, and it does seem better at preserving liberty than other systems, and it does seem to improve people's state of material well-being over time. Collectivist systems seem not to do this. So it was a very practical response.
Yeah. So he's put forward a practical critique to one of the sort of minority reports in Catholic social teaching. He's put a positive vision that at this time is just another minority report in Catholic tradition, and then everything changes. And everything changes with a couple of things, with the collapse of the Soviet Union on the one hand, and then with the John Paul II's encyclical, Centesimus Annis. How much of a vindication of this, of Michael Novak is this, and how much of what we see in the articulation of Catholic social teaching in Centesimus Annis is grounded in sort of Michael Novak's thought?
Well,
Or-
so this is a very interesting question, because Michael Novak, being of Slovak heritage, which he hadn't paid a lot of attention to up until the 1980s, he gets more interested in this when John Paul II gets elected Pope, because he's a fellow Slav from Eastern Europe. And Michael says very positive things about Laborem Exercens, which is John Paul II's first social encyclical, particularly the way it treats human work. John Paul II's second social encyclical, Solicitudo Res Socialis, has a lot to say, interestingly, about entrepreneurship and free enterprise and the moral side of this, and Michael says this is very good. So Centésimos Annos comes out in 1991, and it's answering the question, obviously. The big question is capitalism the way forward? Communism is dead. It hasn't worked. The two great systems, capitalism seems to have triumphed. What does the Catholic Church have to say about this? And we do know, because Michael wrote this down, that he was consulted about what should go into this particular document. By that, I don't mean he was asked to write things or anything like that. But he was consulted by, he doesn't name who. These things are kept very confidential, but he was actively consulted about what this encyclical should say. And I think it's fair to say that there are parts of Centésimos Annos which clearly do reflect the influence of his thinking and some of the ideas contained in the spirit of democratic capitalism. So think the way it talks about entrepreneurship, the way it talks about the dignity of work, the way the encyclical critiques socialism, the way the encyclical critiques the welfare state. And of course, in the encyclical's answer to the question is, it depends what you mean by capitalism.
Yes.
Right? So if capitalism means private property, a dynamic market, competition, private property rights, rule of law, these sorts of things, then the church says it's a qualified yes. If, however, capitalism means what a lot of Catholics at that time would call savage capitalism, by which I think they mean sort of Manchester, this vision of Manchester capitalism of the 19th century, then obviously no. So it's a very nuanced answer. And that was Michael's way of answering these types of questions. And he also got to know John Paul II in this period of time and had meals with him. And I'm not saying that John Paul had Michael Novak bent over his shoulder, whispering in his ear, telling him what to write at all. But we do know that people in the Holy See, people involved in the drafting of these documents, and as you know, they're drafted by many people. It's rare that one person actually sits down and does the whole thing. They clearly were attentive to some of the things that because he'd been proved right.
Yeah.
He'd been proved right about, and he was able to articulate a positive theological vision that matched up what good economic science was saying.
At this point, this is the point where the Acton Institute sort of gets founded at the same time. This is also the point, or shortly after this point, when you become research director of the Acton Institute, and both you personally and the Acton Institute had a long relationship with Michael Novak in the last years of his life. What was sort of Michael Novak's role in shaping those early days of the Acton Institute? Do you have any particular memories of Michael Novak in those days that you think, give us a picture of who he was as a man? I have a story like this.
We all have a Michael Novak story.
We all have a Michael Novak story. Those of us that were privileged to meet him.
So I think the first thing to keep in mind is that Father Sirico, the founder of the Acton Institute, knew Michael Novak very well in the 1980s. Yeah. And I think one of the things that Father Sirico did was basically to operationalize the ideas of Michael Novak in institutional form, and to give an institutional form of a way for people from all sorts of different confessions to engage the market and the market order from a theological and philosophical standpoint that's fundamentally positive. And that's sort of Michael's agenda. That was his agenda, and certainly in the second half of his life. And so I think Michael was always in some respects, the intellectual godfather of the Acton Institute. In fact, I've heard Father Sirico say that many times. And they had a very close relationship. So I got to know Michael in the mid-1990s. I was always interested in questions of natural law and market economics, and I'd written a lot on that, and of course, I'd come across some of his writings in that regard. I actually stayed in his house a couple of times in DC, which was quite an experience. But he was always attentive to what Acton was doing. He was very happy when the Acton Institute set up a prize called the Novak Award that's named after Michael, which is given to someone every year who is perceived to be doing fantastic work in the area of economics and theology, broadly speaking. I think by the late 2000s, early 2010s, he was lecturing at Acton University. Yep. He'd given many lectures in different places for Acton. And I think he saw it as the place that had taken on his vision of this engagement between the world of economics on the one hand and the world of theology on the other. And he would come and give lectures at Acton University. He was quite old by this point, right? So he's in his 80s, and towards the end of his life, he was sort of in a wheelchair and found it difficult to get around. But he would come. Yeah. He would come and talk and give all sorts of really interesting anecdotes and history about everything that was going on. And, he was very close. His wife was very dear to him, and she died before he did. And I think that was a major sort of blow for him, like as it would be in many cases, right? But he was continued to be in the intellectual fray. So when he went down and was teaching at Ave Maria University, he ends up at the Catholic University of America, which is sort of where he started much of his study in the first place. He's doing things with the Bush School of Business at the Catholic University of America. So he's intellectually engaged all the way up until his death. Mm-hmm. And when he died, I remember his funeral was at the Basilica in Washington, D.C. I remember distinctly going to that, and it was really a who's who of the Catholic world that was there. Mainly, I will say, a lot of priests, obviously, but mainly lay people, because he had thought a lot about what it meant to be a lay Catholic in the world. And he sort of knew what it was like to be a cleric, because he'd been in the seminary, right? So he was also very attentive to what it meant to be a lay Catholic in the world, and particularly a lay person, a believer in the world of markets and the world of business, because there wasn't a lot of reflection about those subjects until Michael wrote books like Business as a Calling, which is a very simple book, actually. And it's very good because it really articulates a vocational view of business as something that you're called to do. And that was a very popular book. Yeah.
One of the I was working with Acton by the time Michael Novak came to his last Acton University. And at that point he was having problems with mobility and was primarily wheelchair bound. Father Robert had a lovely sort of interview discussion
I remember that.
in which he teased out all these great stories. And we had one of our emerging leaders who was helping Michael Novak get around everywhere he needed to go during Acton University. And at one point, she runs up to me, and she's got a panicked look in her face. And she goes, "Michael Novak needs wine, and I am not of age." And so I said, "Don't worry, I will go. And I found Michael a glass of wine, and all was well with the world. And afterwards, I sort of checked in with this young lady, and I said, I hope the rest of your day went smoother. And she just told me what a sweet man he was, and he wanted to know all about her, if he had a boyfriend, if she had a boyfriend, if he was treating her right, how she should expect a gentleman to treat her. and was just very sweet. And I heard later from folks at Ave Maria, when he was down there, he would oftentimes, be talking to students and, find out, oh, you're dating so-and-so. And then he would give them $100 and say, hey, take her out someplace nice. And so there's these abstract theological things, but there's also this genuine human warmth and care for people and wanting them to start out on life in a good way and to form families and communities. And
it should be said that he also had a temper.
He did.
I only saw it a couple of times. It was never directed at me, but I saw it directed at other people, and I would not want to be that person. But here's sort of one of my best memories of Michael Novak. So he was an indefatigable traveler. He was anxious to go and talk to audiences all around the world about his ideas. And he was constantly being invited to give papers and presentations all around the world. Wall Street, South Africa, India. He talked about going into some big university in Brazil where he was confronted with all these liberation theologians but so there's two things I can distinctly remember. One is being at a conference with him in Rome, and I said, "So Michael, where are you off to?" He said, "Well, I'm off to South Sudan." "Why are you going there?" "It's pretty violent, right?" I said, "Well, the bishops have asked me to come and talk." I said, "Oh, okay, well, that's great." And I said, "Have you got your suitcase?" "No, I don't need any clothes. There's no point taking any of these things. I just have to go and talk." Because he was just very sort of practical about these sorts of things. And the second thing, which also relates to travel, is that he told me, so even towards the end of his life, when his mobility is very limited, he's still traveling. He's still traveling around the world. And one of his last trips was to Lithuania, where he spoke, he was invited to speak by the Lithuanian Free Market Institute. And they had actually approached me and said, "Do you think you could ask Michael if he could come to Lithuania?" And I said, "Well, I can try. I mean, he's getting on. He's physically not in great shape." So I put it to him, and he, "Sure, I'll do that." But he told me, so he's on some transit place between here and Vilnius in Lithuania, and he's thinking, "What the heck am I doing here? I'm tired. I want to lie down. I've had enough." And then he thought, "It's because of that darn Sam Gregg I'm here." And he told me this later, and he said, "But the thing is, once I got there, it was wonderful because I was talking to people who knew what it was like to live under communism." Lithuania, of course, is a very Catholic country, very much part of that Slavic world that he was very attached to. And he was able to talk to the high and mighty and the low and not so mighty in this relatively obscure Baltic country about many of the ideas that he was interested in, which they were very receptive to because they'd experienced what it looked and felt like to live under a communist system. So those are my two things. His willingness to get up and go, and just in some respects, he liked his creature comforts. He certainly liked those, but it was interesting. He would give them up very quickly if he thought it was important to go to a particular place and just talk about the ideas that he thought were important.
Well, thank you for coming,
My
getting
pleasure.
up and going here to be with us, and for sharing Michael Novak's ideas with us.
Thanks, Dan. Great to be with you.
Thank you for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Acton or hear more of this podcast, please visit acton.org/podcasts. Otherwise, we'll see you next week.